Okay, so first of all, we're 5 days today from the election day, and many more advanced ballots and mail-in ballots and advanced votes have been done. The polls tell us we're in for another minority government, either Liberals or Conservatives. The Eric Grenier compilation poll on CBC is pointing to probably a Liberal minority. Do you think at this point Justin Trudeau regrets calling this election less than 2 years into this term?
Oh, definitely. I think what happened is, I think they felt in terms of the federal government's response to COVID, all the measures they brought in, and, the ability to work with the provinces to coordinate a response in a variety of ways, particularly on supplies, vaccines, things like that. I think they felt, those numbers were quite strong then to carry over into an election to potentially get a majority. And it appears they've been considerably softer than they expected. And, it's to the point where they really can't recover to, in any sense, feel they're going to get a strong majority for sure.
So it's $600 million to get us back to where we were before the election campaign started.
Yeah, it's looking that way, and actually might even be worse for the Liberals and more to the benefit to the Conservatives and to the NDP. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And, sort of after the election, we'll probably have some assessment of just what was achieved through the election. But I think it was largely, it's starting to appear like what it did was, trying to capitalize on the fact that Aaron O'Toole wasn't that well known, and it just didn't pay off. He actually came out quite strong, has done well since the beginning. I mean, I think things have slowed down a bit, but clearly got name recognition out in a positive way. And Jagmeet Singh has performed incredibly well. Strong ads consistently, I thought, was kind of a really strong campaign with respect to saying, we get a lot of talk from Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. Let's see some action. And I think between Aaron O'Toole, quite consistently criticizing the need for the election, and then Jagmeet Singh saying, well, it's here, let's go and beyond talk. I think it's really sort of what's reflected in the polls is really hurt the Liberals, definitely.
Yeah, I think they were hoping for a sheer factor, and it never arose for them. If the Liberals do win a minority, which looks like the best that they can do you think Trudeau has to step down as leader? Is it a failure of that magnitude?
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell at this point. The one thing I would say is probably he is in many ways, just by sheer name recognition, their strongest asset. And I mean, if you were sort of looking for somebody else sort of within the Liberal cabinet or with strong name recognition, I don't think that's there. And so they might be a little kinder with respect to that, mainly because his name recognition, he has done a lot to bring the Liberal Party back from, pre-2015, where they were in such dire shape, just in terms of fundraising and connections and things like that. And so, I think there'll be a lot of reflection about the judgment call on that one, not just by Justin Trudeau, but also by the staff that supported him and advised him on making this call, definitely. So I could certainly see, how would I put it, a bit of a cleaning of house, at least in terms of the advisors he has at this particular time. Whether it brings him down is a bit different question, right? I have to admit, I was a little surprised, given Andrew Scheer's performance in the last election, where he raised the number of votes and seats for the Conservatives. It was a rather strong judgment on his performance, for sure, for him to step down.
Yeah, that was weird. The Conservatives gained seats, the NDP lost seats, but the leaders had different fates. Very bizarre.
Yeah, and that's why I wouldn't necessarily say that Justin Trudeau's fate is sealed by this, but I think the people who are advising him on this and the particular strategy they went forward, even in timing it, in terms of that August, sort of starting in the middle of August, lots of questions need to be raised as to why that was thought, to be a good strategy, especially when you're only gain you really were looking for was to get a majority government. That wasn't like the coalition, or sort of the ability to compromise and collaborate with other parties wasn't there. It wasn't, that toxic an environment. In fact, seemed to be a strong sense by most PQ, NDP, and even the Conservatives to a certain extent to work with the Liberal government in terms of passing legislation and getting things done. So yeah,
I don't think the Liberals were refused anything they wanted to do. They might have had to compromise a bit, but you're right. Now, past elections, many have been defined by a moment. People remember it. In BC in early 90s, we had Gordon Wilson with that famous, this is why nothing gets done in BC quip that got them 17 seats then.
right.
And then we had Brian Mulroney back against John Turner. You had a choice.
Yeah.
There hasn't been nothing. There doesn't seem to be anything like that in this very short election. It seems to be a slow, kind of a tepid election. But is there anything that you've seen that, if not a singular moment, something that might have changed voters' minds during this short campaign?
I think just with respect to the Liberal Party, like it appears that even before the election was called, even though the party was all geared up and everything to move ahead and everything was in place, you could already see the polls softening. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that, mostly I think with the nature of the COVID pandemic, which rather than hoping to be further away from it than we are, we're actually dealing with potentially a fourth wave, and that's on everybody's mind. And and then all the concerns, especially in August, given the fire season we had in BC, but also concerns with that in the rest of Canada, and then having to under the potential new wave of COVID, going back to school and university and things like this. I think a lot of that took a lot of focus off people's wanting to show, basically people weren't that interested in following the election into August and even into September. That's why I was raising the issue about the timing of this, sort of when they actually called it. I think maybe they'd have been further ahead if it was a little bit later in the fall, that the election, but it just seems like terrible timing. The mood across the country with respect to, having to still address a number of different issues is just, on people's minds and in the media, right, in particular. And so I think the problem is the campaigns, and certainly the Liberal campaign, is competing with a lot of other news items that people are following surrounding, particularly, like I say, COVID and the fourth wave in particular, and new measures being adopted in respective provinces, taking us back rather than us trying to imagine yet a sunny scenario where we're past the pandemic and moving ahead. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Plus, we had the forest fires regionally here. We had Afghanistan. We had people going back to school and back to work, so yeah, a lot of people's minds were elsewhere, I think. Now, the pollsters have said that the PPC, People's Party of Canada, will likely not win any seats, save for perhaps Bernier's riding in Quebec, but even that's not a guarantee.
Right.
The CBC poll tracker, the one that averages all the polling, today on September 15th has the PPC at 6.4%, higher than the Greens, but well behind the other parties. Is there anywhere in Canada, Terry, that you see that the PPC vote could be large enough to impact the Conservative vote and benefit the Liberals or NDP?
The only way, couple of places, I think this is the problem. It's a little vague where the concentration of that vote is. I think it has surprised people a bit as to potentially how large it could be, because I think when you're getting that sort of scale of percentage, and the fact that PPC candidates and supporters are quite motivated, so I think you can probably say they're going to go out and vote in strong numbers in ways. How that plays out is a little bit unclear. I guess at this point I'm unsure of where the support is concentrated, mainly because it's a bit of a new phenomena. But I think where probably in terms of fractions, where it plays out the most is particularly in the lower mainland in British Columbia, where there's some pretty close races down in the lower mainland. And like I say, if they're close between, you know, the NDP and the Conservative or Liberal kind of breaking it up, you know, there might be small fractions there. I'm not, and I guess this is, and probably more where you might see it is certainly in and around Toronto, the suburb area, exurbs, areas like that, where, you know, there's strong competition between certainly the Conservatives and the Liberals there for the vote. And whether, you know, this I think we're, what I'm a little bit unclear of yet. I'm unsure of whether it's actually pulls away from the Conservative Party or whether the CCP message has actually activated potentially, you know, voters you might not have seen out there before.
Right.
And I think that's what's hard to measure at this particular time. But I think you're right. Where, like I say, where it's most likely to sort of play out is in those really competitive races, where, you know, potentially if you get down below, you know, margins of 1,000 votes make less than 1,000 votes making a difference. I suspect if you know, it might hurt the Conservatives slightly if they lose some support there for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess they'd be. I guess the PPC is seen by many as a protest movement, much like Reform was in the with different reasons for the protest. But the Reform had the benefit of just being consolidated in the West, like the Bloc is in Quebec, so they could elect a lot more people because they didn't have to worry about spreading themselves thin
Right.
east of Manitoba, I guess. Yeah, it's often said that Ontario, mainly the Greater Toronto area, and to lesser extent Quebec, decide the election usually. Is that true this time?
I think in terms of how this minority situation plays out, I think a lot might count, given that we probably, with respect to largely Manitoba, but certainly Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the interior BC, the Conservatives can feel really secure about the seats that are that they have there already. Where I think where BC might figure in strongly is in the lower mainland between those ridings that are competitive at this point, right? And it's so I mean it's kind of an interesting one since we're not really talking about the Liberals getting a majority. What you're looking at is whether the votes play out in such a way that the Conservatives and the Liberals look like they're really going to have close seats coming into BC. And that's really hard to judge. I suspect from following the polls and sort of what have been some attempts to sort of do some seat projections based on that, there's probably, it looks like given if a minority government is sort of the outcome, I think there's probably a strong sense that Ontario and Quebec will be the deciding factor in that context, because we already have a pretty good sense then, once you get out of Ontario, you know, what the prairies is going to look like. And like I say, whether or not those actual seats turn out to be important in BC, that remains to be seen. I suggest the projections probably say, you know, the Liberals are going to try and capture most of their seats, you know, largely in Ontario and Quebec, and that might be the deciding factor versus the rest of Canada for sure. But still, like I say, again, I think because so many seats are still potentially in play in and around Toronto, you know, it could well be a scenario where the lower mainland becomes critical to sort of deciding, you know, sort of that minority government potentially. Yeah.
In the last election, which was only 23 months ago, I think, the Bloc had a resurgence of sorts in Quebec, and they took back a lot of seats lost to the NDP back when that big Leighton Orange wave, and then the next election. Is there, based on what you're looking at there, can we expect to see the Blocs lose some seats, and if so, to whom?
I think, yeah, the Bloc, there's a sense that I believe both the Conservatives and the Liberals feel that they can make gains within Quebec. And I think it really did surprise everybody in the last election just how much they rebounded just on the issue, like I say, of the federal government potentially, or the federal political parties being perceived as interfering in Quebec's affairs. I think that sentiments, because both parties have been quite deferential to the Quebec, deferential to the Quebec premier. There's a sense that that's softened. And so I think the one party that feels that it's done a lot to address Quebec's concerns are certainly the Liberal Party. And certainly Aaron O'Toole, I think, because he's trying to shift sort of the perception of the party, move beyond sort of a strict focus on economic issues and certainly balanced budget concerns, deficit things, to put out a much larger agenda, makes him more attractive as well. But I think certainly it's the Liberals that are, if anyone's going to gain, I think, from this, it would be the Liberal Party. I think the sense is the Conservatives would certainly, in terms of starting to rebuild in some ways as a national party potentially for the next election, would like to certainly see some gains in Quebec again, definitely for sure. And like I say, Aaron O'Toole's message will be important to see if that works. But it really is the Liberal Party, I think, that's tried the hardest to see if they can, bring Quebec voters out of the PQ support over to themselves, or over to the Liberal Party.
And that explains, for people who may not know, but they do, but that explains the reticence of the parties to get too strong on their condemnations of Bills 21 and 96, etc. Right? So yeah.
I think it's that, and I would actually say it's quite wider than that. I mean, there's a sense in which, they're increasingly, a good example was probably the only thing that sort of hangs over Aaron O'Toole here is Justin Trudeau negotiated with 7 provinces some funding to increase access to affordable childcare. And Aaron O'Toole, came along and said, well, I'm taking that away. And of course, what made it interesting was Quebec was was a major recipient of money to expand their already existing program. And then I was reading in the paper today, he's already somehow, I'm not sure what the content is, sent a letter to the premier, because that was sort of a concern there. Not sure what the content is, but basically, in a sense, trying to say, I don't know, that they'll work around that in some particular way, right? Because Aaron O'Toole wants to sort of cancel that sort of program by the federal government and move to a larger, basically a child tax credit, giving individuals more money. So where it kind of came out in was Quebec, where there was that financial commitment. And, this is kind of the interesting thing, right? So it's not just about constitutional issues. It's also about certain funding arrangements in particular that the Liberals have already negotiated with Quebec. There's a sense everybody's walking very carefully around those as well, to ensure, that they're not, offending, or bringing up, potentially giving the PQ something to run on to further their vote at the last minute. Yeah.
Interesting. Locally, it seems to many that the race here might be between the NDP's Bill Sundu and Frank Caputo, the Conservative candidate, based on the fact that we've had a Conservative MP for the last 20 years, and that Bill Sundu seems to be, he did really well in 2015, and the NDP seems to be, like you mentioned earlier, they're very visible here. How do you see the local race panning out?
Yeah, the only thing I'm really sort of drawing my information from was, I think it's that site 338 Canada gave a poll that gave pretty strong strength to Frank Caputo, John Caputo, is it? John.
Frank Caputo.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Frank Caputo.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a pretty strong like the polling that they received was pretty strong endorsement. And I think what was interesting was, the Liberal and NDP were further behind. I'm not sure how accurate those polls are, but it'd be interesting. I mean, the information is out there, and I'm not exactly sure whether that would then influence, where the vote would potentially go. And there is it'd be kind of interesting to sort of watch the debate on TV tomorrow night to just see what they have to say, and whether I'd be kind of curious as to whether, there's a lot of a sense of what might play well here is a sense that there's a lot of local concerns given what we've gone through with the fires and the kinds of things we need to do about that. And otherwise, like I say, I found, it just seems that just didn't seem to be as many signs around, and like I say, just not as much sort of visibility, mainly I believe because of the kinds of restrictions we're under at this particular point, for sure. But like I say, the only thing I can say is, and I'm not sure how accurate this is, was that with the 338 Canada poll, it really did sort of give the Conservatives a sense that they're going to retain the seat for sure. And I don't know how much flexibility there is in the vote between the Liberals and the Conservatives, or sorry, the Liberals and the NDP, right, whether you're going to get a significant shift enough to actually change that outcome remains to be seen for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't in 2015. That was when Cathy McLeod had her greatest challenge from both the Liberal Steve Powery and Bill Sundu. They both came within 3,000. But last election, which was only 2 years ago, Cathy McLeod had her largest margin of victory ever, and it was against what people thought was the star candidate, Terry Lake. So maybe based on that last election, the Conservatives have some momentum even going into this year.
Yeah, and I think, Cathy McLeod had really, positive name recognition, and long-standing name recognition around here. And I guess that's why I was even somewhat surprised by that poll, was how strong Caputo was doing, because I think, it didn't seem to make a significant difference. And then you get these, like I say, the Cathy McLeod's numbers last 2019 were really solid, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, finally, I'll ask you this question. Can you sum up, I don't want you to make a prediction of who's going to win and what numbers. I do a pool for that if you want to get into it. But what I want to know is, and not numbers, but just generally, of the parties there, who do you see gaining and losing seats? Start with the Liberals. Are they going to gain or lose seats?
Looking at the projections that are out there, they're vulnerable to actually definitely losing seats. And especially when you're talking about polling numbers that are only averaging around, 31, 32%. And, to be anywhere close to majority territory, you need to be 38, 39% in opinion polls. Yeah. And so I think they're definitely at risk of, dropping from what they had the last time. Conservatives, I think that could work out. Last election, Andrew Scheer did get, the largest percentage, most amount of votes, and actually, a higher percentage of votes than the Liberal Party. And I think, it'd be interesting to see if O'Toole can hang on to that for sure. And even though, unfortunately, with our electoral system, it didn't translate into the same kind of outcome as for the Liberals, I think there's room there. Depends on how much outreach they can get, particularly in Ontario, maybe a bit of a breakthrough in Quebec. I think the opportunity for them to increase their seats is there, right? But it's pretty clear too that I think this was the interesting thing to watch about the election was Aaron O'Toole's numbers really went from what were fairly low, mainly due to lack of name recognition. Once he got his message out there and started talking, his numbers really came up significantly. But then they seem to have really hit a wall in a certain way, right? And I think because it's lost that momentum, I suspect they're easily going to have the same amount of seats they have. I don't know, like I say, given our electoral system, whether that will then translate into anything significant beyond what they already have, though. Yeah, it's hard to tell yet.
NDP, I guess they can only go up, right?
They should do well, yeah. And I'm still, like I say, and part of that has to do, I think, with again how those all those races break, particularly in and around the Ontario area. They're certainly not going to be competitive within Quebec. There's just, the sense is from that was the PQ's message, right? And even the premiers, that they're a centrist party, a federal party that wants to, would potentially interfere in the affairs with Quebec. So they're not going to make any breakthrough there, but potentially, I think there is room there, certainly in Ontario, again, because a lot of more races there are competitive, and maybe a bit more in the lower mainland as well. We'll see. It'd be interesting to see just if there's any significant changes for them in the lower mainland for sure.
Finally, the Greens and the PPC. The Greens, I know they lost an MP who crossed the floor, and New Brunswick, I think. I'm not sure how she's doing in the polling. We have the former leader. Her name escapes me right now. She's
Oh, Elizabeth May?
Elizabeth May. I keep thinking Adrian Carr, Elizabeth May. Elizabeth May. Yeah. So she's running in Saanich Filands. But so what do you see? Do you think the Greens are going to like maintain? I know that they're having that turmoil with the leader Anna May Paul and the whole front office. But how about the Greens and the PPC? Do we see them winning any seats at all?
Well, like I say, I'd have to check, but I'm pretty sure. I mean, I think Elizabeth May's a strong candidate where she is, right? Saanich has been fairly loyal to the Green Party, and they seem to have a pretty good, on the ground, outreach, and they get their voters out in sizable numbers there. Unfortunately, it looks weak across the rest of the country, definitely. And I think a lot of it has to do, it's a tough one, right, for the Green Party, because you're not the only one with a green message and a concern for the environment and addressing climate change. You've got all the major contenders are in this as well, right? And so the only thing that kind of separates the Greens from the other party is the sense that they're willing to go further to bring down greenhouse gas emissions and, whatever the potential expenses in certain ways, where, all of the other parties without the exception of the PPC, all the other main parties have, year after year, built up a certain level of expertise and a willingness to, put forward fairly detailed ideas. Not that there's any consensus there, but everybody's in the game. And I think that, I think just that alone, because if you wanted to vote Green in the past, you did it because they were the strongest one with respect to potentially addressing climate change. Now you do have some other serious contenders with strong messages and platforms. And so the internal politics of the Green Party just magnifies the potential of their vote to go elsewhere, I believe. Yeah, for sure. So like I say, if they get one seat out of that, that's great. I'm having a hard time imagining them, picking up another one, but I could be wrong, right? It might be able to hold on. I think this might be able to hold on to that second seat in New Brunswick. I'd have to check on that. But I think it doesn't look like there's any growth there for sure.
No, the polling numbers don't look good. Does Bernier keep his seat or win back his seat? I mean, does he recapture it?
No, I don't think so. But it's sort of interesting. I mean, he's in a weird way, he's kind of happy with where he is. I think he just likes being leader of this party that's actually growing in numbers, whether it gets seats or not. I just, it's almost like he just enjoys the whole exercise of being in the spotlight and challenging the status quo, right? And in a weird way, it kind of follows right out of sort of what was, his campaign to in the leadership race against Andrew Scheer in particular. Yeah, when you think about it, and I mean, he was at the time. I mean, he was willing to, whether it was about internal trade barriers, marketing boards, all these number of different issues, immigration. He was sort of willing to sort of contest the status quo within the Conservative Party on that, and and so I think. He got a lot of press attention from that and hasn't been able to sort of maintain it. And then he wasn't even able to maintain his seat in his riding in Quebec. But I think he's still just, for him, there's no quote losing, right? Whether he gets a seat or not, to him, it probably isn't that important. I think it's more important to, see the overall votes go up and it probably won't likely translate into seats. But I think your point raised earlier, if it actually becomes in particular ridings that are close, the difference maker in certain ways, that'll be, he'll probably have made the impact he wants to in some ways, for sure.
And I guess a minority government again would benefit a party like his because they, theoretically have less time for the next election, and then they can keep the momentum going with their supporters rather than wait the whole 5 years, 5 years if we had a majority.
Yeah, it's an interesting to watch. I was, the difference this time. I think there's a couple different differences from the period when 2004, 2006, and 2008. Where we had minority governments on a regular basis and kept going back. Back then, I mean, we tend to forget that we also had a system that publicly funded the parties per vote for each election. And there was a sense before that was sort of, phased out after 2008, that, that contributed to everybody's willingness to go back. You might end up with a minority government, but you didn't have to, there wasn't necessarily that willingness to compromise because everybody was getting paid on a yearly basis for the number of votes they got in the past election. Whereas I think this context might be a little different. We've had one minority government, and everybody's using a lot of money that's come from a lot of donors and supporters and fundraising efforts. And I think certainly, the healthiest one would be the Conservative Party. I think they've got the strongest donor base. But I think it's a little more risky, certainly for the Liberals and the NDP, to just be always looking so closely at the poll to sort of repeat this exercise in 2 years, right? As long as the other parties come out being if the Liberals get the minority, and as long as the other parties look amenable, I mean, and then, like I say, as you mentioned, the cost of this whole thing, which is borne by these parties, I hope that, I think that might postpone this exercise happening in, like you say, less than 2 years or 2 years. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see, right? There might be, I certainly, unless something dramatic changes to take the fortunes of either the Conservatives or the Liberals well beyond where they are at this point, I think it's really hard to imagine an election in the short term, right? But, I think, because I feel that if the Liberals were to, in too short a time now, go back to another election, I think they're more likely to get punished for that than, maybe more than this election, more likely to get punished for it than appreciated for it until you cover a longer period of time, for sure.
All right. Any other thoughts you have on the election before I let you go?
No, no, I think, like I say, I'm looking forward to it. I mean, at least it might be only minority territory, but, I want to, I think, but even though, how would I put it, the vote, it might not be the quote, a good time for the election. We're not quite sure why the Liberals called it. At the end of the day, these are incredibly important, right? And I think just the fact that the Conservative Party of Canada could potentially form a minority is a really important option versus what the Liberals are doing. And so I think it is an important election in that regard, because there are contrasts in important policies and issues with respect to going forward, for sure.